What they found inside that locked room would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about Rosewood Plantation, and the discovery of a single leather-bound journal would expose a secret so dangerous that 3 generations had kept it buried beneath the kitchen floor. But before we reveal what lay in that darkness for 70 years, you need to understand the woman who sealed it shut in 1956 and why she took that secret to her grave. Margaret Whitmore stood at the entrance to the root cellar beneath Rosewood Plantation's kitchen on a humid August morning in 1956, her arthritic hands trembling as she fitted the final padlock onto the reinforced door, sweat beading on her weathered brow as she worked mortar between the bricks that would seal this doorway forever. And as she pressed each brick into place, tears streamed down her 73-year-old face because she knew she was bearing the truth along with the room's contents, a truth that had been whispered only in the dark corners of Rosewood for nearly a century. The plantation house itself was a monument to antebellum grandeur, its white columns rising like sentinels above the Mississippi Delta, its sprawling grounds once worked by over 300 enslaved people who toiled in the cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. And though the Civil War had ended 91 years earlier, the Whitmore family had maintained ownership of the property through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, 2 world wars, and into the modern era of the 1950s when Margaret, the last of her line, made the decision that would haunt future generations. What could possibly be hidden beneath a kitchen floor that warranted such extreme measures, and why would an elderly woman spend her final years ensuring that no one would ever discover what lay below? The answer begins not in 1956, but in 1858, when her great-grandmother, Abigail Whitmore, was mistress of Rosewood and presided over the plantation with an iron will that was famous and feared throughout 3 counties. Abigail was not like other plantation mistresses of her era. She had been educated at a women's college in Philadelphia, where she had been exposed to abolitionist literature and ideas that conflicted violently with the world she would inherit when she married Jonathan Whitmore and moved to Mississippi. And this internal conflict created a duality in her character that would have profound and dangerous consequences. Historical records show that Abigail kept meticulous journals, documenting not just the household accounts and social calendar that most plantation mistresses recorded, but also her observations, her doubts, and eventually, her rebellion against the very system that gave her comfort and status. In the spring of 1859, a young enslaved woman named Sarah arrived at Rosewood, purchased at auction in Natchez along with her 4-year-old daughter, Lily, and from the moment Abigail saw Sarah, something shifted in her conscience that could not be undone. Sarah was educated, having been taught to read and write by a previous owner's daughter before that kindness was discovered and Sarah was sold away as punishment. And when Abigail discovered Sarah's literacy during a chance encounter in the kitchen garden, she made a decision that would have seen her ostracized, prosecuted. Or worse, if it had been discovered, she would use Sarah to help enslaved people escape north via the Underground Railroad. The kitchen at Rosewood was separate from the main house, as was common in plantation architecture, both to reduce fire risk and to maintain social separation, and beneath this kitchen was a large root cellar where vegetables, preserves, and supplies were stored in the cool darkness. But what no one except Abigail, Sarah, and later a select few others knew, was that this root cellar had a false wall that opened into a much larger chamber, a room that had been constructed during the original building of the plantation by enslaved craftsmen who had built in this hidden space, perhaps with their own eventual escape in mind. Abigail and Sarah transformed this hidden room into a station on the Underground Railroad, and over the next 6 years, from 1859 until 1865, they helped over 140 enslaved people pass through Rosewood on their journey to freedom, an astonishing number that made this one of the most active and successful stations in the Deep South. The operation was incredibly dangerous and required elaborate deception, Abigail would stage dramatic punishments and public shows of cruelty to maintain appearances, while secretly she and Sarah would coordinate with conductors, hide refugees, and arrange for the next leg of their journey north. The hidden room became a way station of hope in a landscape of despair, and Sarah became not just Abigail's co-conspirator but her truest friend, perhaps the only person who knew the complete truth of Abigail's soul. But in April of 1865, just weeks before the war would end, disaster struck when Jonathan Whitmore, who had been away fighting with the Confederate Army, returned home unexpectedly, grievously wounded and bitter with defeat. And in his weakened, fevered state, he discovered evidence of what his wife had been doing. The confrontation that followed was violent and tragic, and what happened in that hidden room beneath the kitchen on the night of April 10, 1865, would be the reason Margaret Whitmore sealed it 70 years later. According to the journal that would eventually be discovered, Jonathan came down into the kitchen during a thunderstorm, suspicious of the amount of food that seemed to be disappearing, and he forced open the root cellar door, where he found the hidden entrance ajar and heard voices coming from the chamber beyond. In his rage, Jonathan armed himself and descended into that hidden room where he found Abigail, Sarah's daughter Lily, who was now 10 years old, and 3 men who were fleeing north, 2 who had escaped from a neighboring plantation, and 1 who was a free black conductor on the railroad. Jonathan's fury was apoplectic, and in the chaos that followed, shots were fired, oil lamps were knocked over, and when the smoke cleared, Jonathan Whitmore lay dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. One of the refugees had been killed, and Sarah had been struck by a bullet that would prove fatal within hours. Abigail was faced with an impossible choice. She could report what had happened and face trial for treason, for her husband's death and for her years of Underground Railroad activity, which would result in her execution and would mean death or re-enslavement for Sarah, Lily, and the surviving refugees, or she could conceal the truth and live with the consequences. With Sarah dying in her arms, Abigail made her choice, and with the help of the surviving conductor and another enslaved woman named Grace, who had assisted in the Underground Railroad operations, they buried Jonathan and the deceased refugee in the hidden room itself, sealed beneath the floorboards in a section of the chamber that they then walled off and disguised. The official story was that Jonathan had died from his war wounds, which was plausible given his condition, and he was given a proper burial in the family cemetery with full Confederate honors. But the body in that grave was actually the refugee who had died, while Jonathan's body remained in the hidden room beneath the kitchen where he had died. Sarah lived only until the following dawn, and she made Abigail promise 2 things before she died. First, that Lily would be raised as free and educated, and second, that the truth of what had happened in that room and the truth of the Underground Railroad station would be protected so that no one who had helped could ever be implicated, because even with the war ending, the danger to black people who had participated in such activities remained extreme. Abigail kept both promises, and after the war ended and emancipation came, she formally adopted Lily as her ward, claiming that the girl was the orphaned daughter of a distant cousin, and she used her resources to ensure Lily received an education and eventually married well, and Lily's descendants, though they passed for white through the generations, carried the secret of their ancestry and the hidden room. Abigail herself lived until 1889, and in her final journal entry, she wrote explicit instructions that the hidden room must never be opened, while anyone who had participated in the Underground Railroad or their immediate descendants was still alive, because the evidence in that room could still be used to prosecute or harm people she had sworn to protect. She passed this knowledge and this burden to Lily, who passed it to her daughter, who passed it to Margaret, and each generation maintained the seal and the secret. Over the decades, the kitchen fell into disuse as modern amenities were added to the main house, and by the 1920s it had become a storage building, and by the 1950s it was rarely entered at all. But Margaret, who had been told the story by her grandmother when she was a young woman, knew exactly what lay beneath those floorboards and why it had to remain hidden. In 1956, when Margaret learned she had terminal cancer and had no children to pass the secret to, she made the decision to seal the room permanently. And she spent her final months gathering the materials and the strength to brick over the entrance and add multiple locks, ensuring that the room would remain closed even after her death. She left a letter with her lawyer with instructions that it be opened only if someone ever discovered the room. But she made the entrance so secure that she believed it would never be found, and she died 3 months later, taking with her the last living connection to the truth of what had happened beneath Rosewood Plantation. 70 years passed, and Rosewood changed hands several times, eventually being purchased by a historical preservation society in 2024 that planned to restore the property and open it as a museum, and in the summer of 2026, during a structural assessment of the old kitchen building, ground, penetrating radar revealed an anomaly beneath the floor, a large void that shouldn't exist according to the original building plans. The preservation team was puzzled because the current floor plans showed only a standard root cellar, but the radar indicated a much larger space, and when they carefully removed the brick facade that Margaret had installed, they found the padlocked door, and behind it, after they brought in specialized equipment to carefully break the seal without damaging potential historical artifacts, they found the hidden room that had been closed for 70 years. What they discovered inside was extraordinary and heartbreaking: the skeletal remains of 2 individuals, one of whom was later identified through DNA analysis as Jonathan Whitmore, whose body had supposedly been buried in the family cemetery, and the other was eventually identified as a man named Thomas Freeman, a free black conductor on the Underground Railroad who had been presumed to have died in a fire in Tennessee in 1865. The room also contained trunks filled with clothing, blankets, medical supplies, food containers, and most importantly, a complete archive of the Underground Railroad station's operations, including Abigail Whitmore's journals which documented every person who had passed through, with names, descriptions, destinations, and notes about their circumstances. There were maps marked with safe routes, forged freedom papers, Confederate currency that had been used to bribe officials, and letters of gratitude from people who had made it to freedom, sent back through secret channels to let Abigail know they had arrived safely. The historians who examined these materials realized they were looking at one of the most complete and detailed records of Underground Railroad operations ever discovered in the Deep South, and the implications were staggering. The journals revealed not just the logistics of the operation, but the human stories. There was the family of 7 who had hidden in the room during a snowstorm while slave catchers searched the property above. There was the young man who had been so terrified he couldn't stop shaking until Sarah had sung to him through the night. There was the elderly woman who had walked over 300 miles to reach Rosewood, and who kissed the ground when she learned she would be moving north. Abigail's writings also revealed her internal struggle, her guilt over the privileges she enjoyed while helping others escape the same system that benefited her, her fear of discovery, and her deep love and respect for Sarah, whom she described as the bravest person she had ever known. The journals also contained the complete account of what happened on that terrible night in April 1865, written in agonizing detail, including Abigail's admission that it was actually she who had shot Jonathan, not in murder but in defense of Sarah, whom Jonathan had been beating with the intent to kill, and that Sarah's wound had come from Jonathan's weapon during the struggle. This revelation meant that Abigail had lived with the guilt of killing her husband while also grieving the loss of her dearest friend, and that she had maintained the deception not to protect herself, but to protect everyone else who had been involved. The discovery also included a small leather bag containing items that had belonged to Sarah Hand, carved wooden doll that had been made for Lily, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, and a small Bible with Sarah's name inscribed inside, along with a note from Abigail that read, "Here lies my friend, my teacher, my conscience, the woman who showed me what courage truly means. History may never know her name, but God does, and I do, and that will have to be enough." The Preservation Society faced difficult questions about how to handle this discovery. They had found evidence of a homicide. Even though everyone involved had been dead for over a century, they had discovered that a prominent Confederate figure was not actually buried in his own grave, and they had uncovered a story that challenged the historical narrative of the plantation and the region. After consulting with historians, ethicists, legal experts, and descendants of both the Whitmore family, and, through genealogical research, descendants of Sarah, and some of the people who had been helped by the Underground Railroad station, they decided to tell the complete truth. Jonathan Whitmore's remains were exhumed from the hidden room and given a proper burial, but not with Confederate honors, and his gravestone now includes the dates of his actual death and a notation that he died at Rosewood. Thomas Freeman's remains were returned to his descendants for burial with full recognition of his heroism. The hidden room itself has been preserved exactly as it was found and is now the centerpiece of the Rosewood Plantation Museum, which tells not the sanitized story of Southern grandeur, but the complex, painful, and ultimately redemptive story of Abigail Whitmore and Sarah, whose full name was discovered through the journals to be Sarah Grace Freeman, sister to Thomas Freeman, a detail that added even more poignancy to the tragedy. Lily's descendants came forward, reclaiming their African-American heritage publicly for the first time, and several of them now serve on the museum's board, ensuring that Sarah's story is told with the dignity and honor she deserves. The museum's exhibits include the complete journals, the artifacts from the hidden room, and interactive displays that tell the stories of the 140 people who passed through that Underground Railroad station, including the 23 whose descendants have been located and who contributed their families' stories to the historical record. Visitors can see the hidden room, can stand in the space where so much fear and hope commingled, and can read Abigail's words describing her transformation from a conflicted beneficiary of slavery to an active resistor, and Sarah's bravery in risking everything not just for her own freedom, but to help others achieve theirs. The discovery beneath Rosewood Plantation's kitchen has become one of the most significant historical findings related to the Underground Railroad in the past 50 years, and it has sparked renewed research into other plantations and historical sites where similar hidden histories might still be waiting to be discovered. But perhaps more importantly, it has given voice to people like Sarah, whose heroism was deliberately hidden to protect them, but whose stories deserve to be told. And it has shown that history is not always what it appears to be, that sometimes the greatest truths are the ones that have been most carefully concealed, and that the courage to do what is right, even when it costs everything, deserves to be remembered and honored. Margaret Whitmore sealed that room in 1956, believing she was protecting people who were long dead. But what she was really doing was preserving one of the most powerful testimonies to human courage, compassion, and the lengths to which people will go to help others achieve freedom. And while she could never have imagined that the room would be discovered and the story would be told, perhaps she would find some peace in knowing that Sarah's name is no longer hidden in darkness, but is instead honored in the light, and that the secret that burdened 4 generations has become a story that inspires countless others to stand up against injustice whenever and wherever they find it. Because that is the true legacy of the locked room beneath the plantation kitchen, opened after 70 years.